Alright, so I figured out kind of how to sparge that. I just kind of dumped it over and it didn't make too much of a mess, but anyway, that's kind of a pain in the ass. You could also use a tea kettle, I guess, but anyway. So as I was sparging and those grains were rinsing, I had the heat on, so it's basically getting up to a boil. That's the next step, is the boil. And right when it's getting hot like this, see how much water's in there? About at least 4 gallons about. When it's getting up to a boil is exactly the perfect time to put in this extract. Shit. It's hot enough. It's hot enough to dissolve this extract. Let me set this down. And this you just pour in there and stir and make sure it doesn't clump too bad. But it's kind of like extract is like if we just did the mash, it's like if you do the mash but evaporate all the water from it. That's what this powder is. So try to watch me stir this shit in. All those grains I dumped in the garbage. I also left some out in a Tupperware for Katie because she makes bread. Of course, there's different kinds of extract depending on what beer you want to brew, because some people brew just with this extract. So there's a bunch of different varieties. There's like, you know, dark extract for people that want to brew a stout, and this is golden light. I've actually never used this before, but the Bell's recipe called for it. It probably doesn't add much color or anything. It's probably a lot like the two-row barley that I'm using. That's probably what it's supposed to emulate. This sucker's going to be full to the gills. Oh my gosh. One thing you definitely got to worry about is for it to boil over, because it fucking makes a huge mess. So once it starts getting up to 200 degrees or whatever, you really got to keep a good eye on it and keep your hand on the frickin' burners, especially with an electric stove. Wow. The sucker's full to the gills. I've never had this much wort in here before. This is going to be tough. I've had it boil over twice and it's such a fucking mess, it sucks. Alright, so it'll probably, this is kind of clumpy. Here, let me show you. It's kind of clumpy. You got to get the clumps out and basically just wait for it to boil. It should take another 5 or 10 minutes to boil. And then, so the next major part is just going to be the 60-minute boil. There's 2 main steps to brewing. It's mashing and then boiling. And boiling is just to basically add the hops, which add bitterness to the beer, flavor, and then aroma, in that order. Alright, I'm going to turn it on next after I've got the boil like under control, because it definitely takes a few minutes to get. Once you start seeing it starting to boil, you have to bring the temperature down so it doesn't boil over, and then you got to mess with it for a while. It helps to stir it too, so it won't boil over. And then I'll probably lose like at least a half gallon of this liquid, maybe even a gallon, while it boils because of the evaporation. Because when you're boiling it, you're not supposed to have the top on it either. So, alright. This is pre-boil. I put in the extract. I'm done with my grains. I got my extract in there. The only thing left is the hops. Alright, here we go. I basically got to a boil. This is the first time I use this, but if you spray cold water on it, it'll keep it from boiling over. So I actually did that and it worked. And then I stirred it a lot, and I start the timer. You can't see that. But anyway, I started the timer for a 60-minute boil. Now in all the beers I've made, I've actually put hops in right away. The way that hops works is at the beginning of the boil, if you put hops in, it makes it really bitter. It makes your beer bitter. If you put the hops in towards the middle of the boil, like at 30 minutes, it makes it bitter, but it also adds to the flavor. And then if you put it towards the end of the boil, like at 5 or 1 minute or whatever, it gives it flavor and a lot of aroma. So bitterness, flavor, and then aroma in that order. But for some reason the Two-Hearted recipe has me boil it for 15 minutes, I think, before putting any hops in. So let's see. Can't see shit. So 1.2 ounces of Centennial at 45 minutes, and then another 1.2 ounces at 30 minutes. So we're basically just going to boil the beer for 15 minutes, and once my watch says 15, then I'm going to put in the first addition of hops. But right now it's just on a nice boil. Alright, according to our recipe, it's 15 minutes into the boil. Time for our first addition of hops. You don't have to use a scale, but I'm basically measuring out 1.2 ounces. Normally, if I didn't have a scale, I'd just put in an ounce. So alright, that's a little too much. So that's more like 1.5 ounces, which is fine, whatever. Alright, so I'm going to set it down because sometimes it can actually boil over because of the hops. And you just stir it in. You kind of want to stir every once in a while. You're supposed to stir it. Stir those hops in. And it's actually already went down quite a bit from evaporation. So all those hops I just put in are going to be all the bitterness that you taste in Two-Hearted Ale is actually just from that amount of hops. And it's because I'm putting it in at the beginning of the boil. All those AA bittering percentages that I showed you at the beginning, those are all going towards the bitterness. It's basically an oil in the hop plant that gets boiled for long enough, and that becomes bitter. Anyway, that's it. That's the first hop addition. Like I said, that the hops that Two-Hearted uses sort of like a middle of the road when it comes to bitter. There's really more bitter hops that you can throw in there that'll make it way more bitter than Two-Hearted. I think Kitty's home. Alright, smells awesome. And the next hop addition is going to be at 30 minutes. So in 15 more minutes, we're going to put another 1.2 ounces in. If you're doing it, like I said, just put 1 ounce in. It's not a big deal. That's the strainer I was using. I just kind of washed it off. The yeast, you want to just let that sit because it's supposed to be room temperature when you actually pitch it. So you just let it sit for a while. That's the grains I left for Katie. And alright, I'll turn it back on when it's number 2. Alright, 30 minutes into the boil. That's what it looks like. I've already put the 45-minute hop in. 15 minutes into the boil, and now 1.2 ounces at 30 minutes. Here it goes. Boom! That's it. That's actually all the hops that goes in the two-hearted in the boil. So now we just boil it for 30 more minutes, and then we're on to the next step, which is cooling it down and throwing it into the fermenter bucket. But the reason that two-hearted only puts this much in the boil is because, and you'll see this in a different video, is because it dry hops to give it the flavor and the aroma that two-hearted has. So basically they put in hops when it's in the bucket. So basically that happens like a week from now. After it's done fermenting, they throw hops in the bucket, and that's called dry hopping, and that'll give it a bunch of aroma and flavor. But all the hops that goes in it during the boil is actually just for bitterness, not much for flavor. I think that's it. Alright, we're almost done with the boil. We got only 2 minutes left. These jugs of water that I showed you earlier, I just put in the freezer so they'll cool down, because I'm gonna add that to the really hot wort that I've been boiling, the beer. So that's gonna, here's my beer I'm boiling still. So this hot beer, basically you have to cool down to 70 degrees, which is room temperature. Right now it's at like, I don't know, 220 or whatever boiling is. So what we have to do is, when that's done boiling, we have to cool it down as fast as you can. So I fill the tub with cold water, and basically I'm going to put it in there and stir it in cold water for like 5 minutes, maybe 10. And then after that, I'm going to put it in the fermenting bucket. That's just sanitizer in there. I'm going to dump it in the fermenting bucket and add the cold water from the basement I just showed you, and then hopefully it'll even out to about 70 degrees. I'll take the temperature. Once it's at 70, I'll pitch the yeast. There's the yeast, and I'll seal that fucker up and it'll be done. I'll put the camera on when I'm actually cooling the wort in the bathtub, which is right now.